I started the Real Mental podcast because it bugs me when film and TV miss the mark about how mental health gets portrayed. Real Mental is a podcast where a film-loving psychiatrist, that's me, talks to a film critic to help people figure out their lives by getting to the truth about mental health in the movies. Welcome, Kimberley Jones, to the Real Mental podcast.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, I'm very excited today because as we were chatting about before we started recording, we're going to talk about Asteroid City, which I described as a bonkers film.
Very aptly, yes.
And I just thought it would be wonderful to talk to someone who reviews films about your feelings about this film before I started giving my impression about the mental health and those aspects.
Sure. Well, this is an incredibly dense film, so we're going to muddle through it together.
Okay. So tell me, what did you think of it? I mean, obviously, you know the director and you've seen his other films.
Oh, absolutely. I'm Texas-based. I'm the editor of the Austin Chronicle, and Wes Anderson is from Texas. In fact, he went to the University of Texas, as did I. He's about 10 years older than me, so his movies for me were super influential. You know, Bottle Rocket, his first film, I had it on VHS tape. I watched it obsessively with my roommates. And then Rushmore came out when I was in college. And then The Royal Tenenbaums came out in my first year as a working film critic. So just really, really important to me. And it's been really exciting. I think everybody experiences this, not just film critics, but when you have filmmakers that you adore at a young, impressionable age, and then you sort of grow up with them and watch them evolve more or less at the same time that you are as a human. So every time there's a new Wes Anderson film, I get very, very excited. And I was really excited about Asteroid City. This is a really challenging film, especially, I think, on first watch. And I know you found me because I reviewed it for the Austin Chronicle. And I do this pretty frequently, we have to give star ratings. And I think I gave it 3.5 out of 5 stars, while still saying, like, this moved me tremendously. I love this movie, but I've since rewatched it a couple times, and I think it's a masterpiece. I really do. I think that the more people rewatch it, the more you get past the first super dense experience of just trying to figure out what's going on. And we can get into that. But once you get past that and you find your bearings in this film, I think that it's just a really, really rewarding experience.
So why don't we kind of give the thumbnail? Why don't you give the little thumbnail about what this film is about? I'm putting my fingers in air quotes because
I was worried you were going to ask this.
Well, yeah. That's your job.
Sure. So, okay. How do we describe the plot of Asteroid City? I think that there's basically 3 layers. And this is going to sound so complicated, but once you get the handle of it in the film, it's not that complicated. But I'm looking at notes because I knew you were going to ask me this, and I did some prep work. So basically, the framing device is a 1950s TV program about a theater production of a play. That's the simplest version. That's the way in. So basically, we're watching that program, which is modeled after the anthology drama series of the golden age of television. So this is set in the 1950s when you turn on your TV and there would be plays. They were taped live and they featured people from the Actors Studio in New York, famous studio where the method acting was developed. And anybody cool of that era, like, Marlon Brando and Paul Newman and James Dean, they all went through the Actors Studio. Anyway, so there's this TV program about the making of a play, and all of this is in black and white. And so we meet the cast, we sort of see the rehearsal process of this play, and the play is called Asteroid City. So eventually I say eventually, this all happens in the first 4 minutes of the film. So anyway, the play itself is called Asteroid City. We transition to the play, only the play is in full color and it's shot like a movie. If you watch the trailers for Asteroid City, everything you see in the trailers is this part of the film. It's a 3-act story about a widower father played by Jason Schwartzman, and he arrives in Asteroid City with his family, his teenage son, Woodrow, and then they've got 5-year-old triplet daughters who are adorable and the source of much dark humor in the film. So Woodrow's winning an award for the Junior Stargazers Society, and their father and son connect with a mother and daughter who are there for the same reason. That's Scarlett Johansson's part. She plays a movie star who's sort of estranged from her daughter. And then while they're there, there's an alien visitation. And then the entire community of Asteroid City is put into quarantine, which of course we have all emerged from a couple years of lockdown. And so people are going to see, the contemporary resonance there. So that's the thumbnail that I actually fit in about the palm of my hand. That barely scratches the surface. And basically, over the course of the movie, we're watching the action in Asteroid City, the play. I'm using air quotes right now, the play. And then we'll cut back to the black and white backstage, and we'll see the actors and the playwright and the director sort of chewing over, well, am I playing this character right? And why did the playwright choose to do it this way? And I don't understand the meaning behind this. And I'm sure we're going to get into that all. It's not just about the creation of this play. So did that make any sense at all? I mean, you've seen it, so yes, it probably did to you.
Yeah, for sure. And I've not only seen it, but I've read about it because I wanted to also be prepared. And, I read articles and reviews and things like that about it to understand it, because I was trying to figure out, as a psychiatrist who, I go to see films because I feel like films enable us to understand ourselves better, right? They're like a window on humanity, on our lives, on our psyches. And they mirror us in this non-realistic way. And certainly Asteroid City really does that well. But in this, in this fictional way, they show us a deeper truth about ourselves. That's what I think about art in general, and film, which is such a powerful media because it has, all the different media combined, right? So
absolutely.
So I feel like the one question I have is, I wonder why Wes Anderson used this particular, nesting doll technique, because I found that it made it, at least initially, even for you're saying, less accessible and harder to connect to. It seemed like, and even the actors in the play are going, I don't understand my character's motivation. Am I playing it right? Because I don't understand this play. So even, it's just so funny because, well, the characters in the movie who are pretending to be characters in a play are saying, I don't understand what's going on. And I'm looking at it and I'm going, I'm not sure I understand why this is all happening this way. So what do you make of that? Like, how do you see it? Because for me, I want that immediacy. I want that connection, right? And and it seems, at least on the surface, that he made it harder for us to connect.
Yeah, initially. and I do understand that sort of desire for an immediacy and an immediate clarity, and he's sort of throwing up these seemingly distancing measures. But yeah, in Wes Anderson films, he frequently creates these sort of constructs or framing devices. Whether there's a narrator in some of his films, Royal Tenenbaums, he has an unseen narrator. Similarly, in Moonrise Kingdom, there's a narrator sort of walking you through. Grand Budapest Hotel, same deal. There's an author who's sort of telling the story behind his famous book, which is actually based on interviews that he had. And it gets pretty heady in all of his films.
Yeah.
But in this one in particular, for me, and I want to throw a big old asterisk over everything that I say, which is this is obviously only my interpretation, and I have zero insights into the wonderful mind of Wes Anderson. But for me, I think that he is doing this particular device because I think that this is about as naked an expression of his own process as an artist as he's ever put out there. And it's sort of giving us insight into how he creates and whether or not it does mean it does. I think what he's saying in part is that the creative process doesn't always make sense to him either. So that's why his characters are articulate, are verbalizing that. I don't know what it all means. Now, I think that there's a sort of parallel resonance there where I think it's not just about what it means to be an artist creating. I think it's also about what it means to be a human muddling through. I think everything that he's saying about the artistic process and the mysteries of it apply also to what it means to be human in this world, especially during a moment of crisis and calamity. In the film or in the play, in the film's play, it's that there's this alien sighting and that triggers a quarantine. While there's also the widower, he's dealing with the loss of his wife. So there's a lot of calamity happening there. And there's similar crises happening in the play behind the play of somebody dies, a marriage is breaking up. It's everybody's going through something. And I think what Wes Anderson is getting at is trying to connect what it means to be an artist in the world and what it means to be just a human. And they're not, the two concepts are not divorced from each other, obviously.
Yeah.
But that's the read I get it. And also I should say he has said in interviews that one of the inspirations for the film is that he wanted to write about the 1950s era and specifically the effect of undiagnosed PTSD on a lot of guys coming back from the war. And I think that is, it's not overt. He doesn't have any pretty speeches about it in the film, but you definitely feel that in terms of men being unable to really articulate what they're feeling. And if people are talking about feelings for too long, they want to change the subject. And Jason Schwartzman's performance as Augie, he's a war photographer who has absolutely seen terrible things. And he talks with his teeth gritted, and he's just that sort of a portrait of that 1950s guy who does not want to talk about his feelings, but is holding so much pain within him.
Yeah, that makes tremendous sense because I was thinking a lot about his character because his character seems like the most obvious in terms of having like emotional issues, right? And he was a war photographer and he mentions that. And he just lost his wife and he made this bizarre decision not to tell his children about it for 3 weeks, right? So,
Sure.
so his behavior read the most obviously like this guy is having some issues. He's struggling with his own mental health. And that I could connect with, even though the character was hard to connect with, right? Like the character was so shut off and so repressed that he wasn't immediately available, right? You couldn't empathize with him. But on the other hand, as a psychiatrist, I could look at him and go, oh yeah, this guy is really in trouble. Because the more rigid and clenched, as you say, he was, the more I could see, oh yeah, this guy's just about to like fall apart. And then of course he has that scene where he sticks his hand on the quickie griddle and he burns himself on purpose because he needs to feel something in the moment. And so that's exactly the kind of crazy, bonkers, as I say, crazy behavior of someone who, they repress, and then they do something mad. Right?
And of course, Wes Anderson absolutely knows that you're reacting to the character that way because then he puts in the mouths of the actor who's playing the character. He literally says, why does Augie burn his hand on the quickie griddle? And he stops the action in the play in this marvelous third act. Should we say there are going to be spoilers? We're going deep in spoiler country here. Is that he breaks the sort of artifice of the Asteroid City play, removes himself from it, and transitions from color to black and white. The actor is asking, why does Augie burn his hand on the quickie griddle? He cannot penetrate what is going inside the head of this guy who is deeply racked with grief and an inability to move forward. And then that kicks off this, I think, just truly gorgeous stretch of the third act where it's just him sort of wondering, what am I doing here? What is it all for? Why is this guy this way? I hate being inside this guy's head. So he's sort of saying out loud all the things that the viewer might be thinking of, like, oh God, this Augie guy really needs to figure out how to move forward. And yeah, I just think it's tremendous. And I think it's just a really, really impressive, just daring feat for a filmmaker to just say, you know what, you might get real confused about what's going to happen next, but let's just do it. Let's dive into this together and take what you want from it. And for me, it's just, like I said, I've seen it a few times now. And every time I see it again, I'm taking different things away from it. Yeah.
Yeah. And equally, we're talking about Augie, then he has this kind of relationship with Scarlett Johansson's character playing this, well, she's playing an actress who's playing an actress, Midge.
Right.
So confusing. But anyway, so this famous actress, Midge, whose daughter is one of the contestants for this prize that Augie's son ultimately wins, she's also very traumatized by her own experiences, possibly from being a Hollywood star. Obviously, she's in the movie, she talks about having these bad men in her life who mistreated her. So her behavior is also quite odd. Right. It's hard to understand because she's sort of hot and cold toward him and she's sort of diffident, but then she seems interested. And I think he's confused. Augie's character is confused about, is she or isn't she? And then there's these other men who are hovering around who are interested in her, including his father-in-law, who's another whole interesting character we can get into. But I think that she's also an interesting character because it's not your typical female role, for sure. She plays it so quietly. It's so subtle. Her distress and her, even her alienation with her daughter, she plays it so subtly and so small. It's a very unique take on a troubled person. Most Hollywood movies, you have a troubled woman, it's capital T, and they're histrionic. This woman is troubled in such a quiet way, you'd almost miss it if you blinked.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think that what you're seeing is just years and years and years of defenses built up to protect herself. And yeah, she's not acting out. It's a very tightly coiled inside performance. I think it's incredible. And I think that Scarlett Johansson was born to play a 1950s starlet. Also in the 1950s black and white section too. She looks like she walked straight out of she's a Hitchcock blonde, she just really, really terrific stuff. But I think that the reason why they connect, and she at one point says this to him, of that they have this common deep hurt that they both carry around, and they don't really want to talk about it. They don't want to share it with people, but they are both deeply wounded, and they just have this innate understanding of the other. Yeah, but it's interesting, she's practicing, she's rehearsing for an upcoming role. And so he's running lines, and it's really cute. It's in a motor court, and they're basically at their windows staring at each other in opposite little bungalows. And so they're talking back and forth, and they're running lines, and she's got like a death scene, and he can't get to the level that she wants him to get at. And she says to him, use your grief to try to inspire a better performance out of him. And he plays along, and then it's 2 minutes later, if that he goes and he burns his hand on the griddle. And it's so clearly use your grief is what sparked that for him.
Except he didn't really use his grief. He needed to distract himself from it by causing himself some physical pain almost, right?
Well, that's interesting. I think that he does actually, or maybe it was simply the use your grief triggered something in him that, I don't know, reminded him of the grief. I'm not sure, but he does. It's a very subtle, to use your word. He also is giving, for all of the sort of ticks of Jason Schwartzman's performance, it's a very mannered performance, which then, as the actor playing the character, he asks, "Oh, I feel like I'm doing too much." But in that moment, he tears up just a little bit. Like use your grief definitely triggers something in him. And then he goes and he burns his hand. So yeah. There's a lot going on here, and we haven't talked about a lot of this stuff is mirrored in the black and white backstage section, where there's a group of people, sort of the film's analog for the actor studio. There's about 30 actors in a class, and they're being coached by, I think he might be a Lee Meisner analog, who's one of the method actor people. Anyway, I'm getting too in the weeds with this, but they're doing this sort of experimental exercise with the playwright who's trying to write a scene, and he instructs all the actors to act like they've fallen asleep. And I should say, this is really funny. This is at its core, this is a comedy. So they're doing this, and it's kind of funny, but all of a sudden one of them shouts, "You can't wake up if you don't fall asleep." And then they all start chanting this, "You can't wake up if you don't fall asleep." And the first time I saw it, it felt so inscrutable. I just could not figure out what this meant. But I think it's all right there. It's the same reason that Augie, wading through tremendous grief, burned his hand on the griddle to feel something different. And I feel like that's sort of what the message, if you can't wake up if you don't fall asleep. Similarly, stasis followed by catharsis, it's you're wading through something, and then you get a jolt that gets you out of it. But you can't get the jolt if you don't experience, or you can't get the high if you don't experience the low,
Yeah.
I don't know if I don't know if it's right or not, but that's where I landed with it, at least.
I guess when you're dealing with art, with art as opposed to a product, it leaves us questioning a lot of things. We can't have that certainty because, if it's handed to us on a platter, pre-digested morsels of, cultural product, it's very obvious and it's not very interesting and we don't have any questions about it. But when we're dealing with art, as we know through the history of art of all types, there are going to be questions, there's going to be controversy, there's going to be disagreement, there's going to be fights. Some people is going to say this is garbage, some people is going to say this is a masterpiece. And that's a nice thing about art. It's that it makes you think and it makes you question, and you can't have that certainty. So I think
absolutely. And I think one of the most interesting things about it is that we're all going to have a different interpretation. And it's sort of Wes Anderson did his job and he delivered this movie, and the rest is up to us. It's to the individual viewer to figure out what it means to them. And I think that my relationship to grief informs my experience of this film. And there are certain things that spoke to me because of my relationship to grief. And that's going to be different from your relationship to grief. And so I think it's broad enough and experimental enough that there's going to be something for anybody to latch onto that's going to maybe have a different meaning. And it's okay if you and I think totally opposite things about this movie. I think that it's more effective that way, honestly, and more interesting.
For sure. Well, we both agree that it's a little bit bonkers. So that's at least one thing.
Yeah, it's definitely, yeah.
I'm Dr. Marcia Sirota. We all need to be inspired and uplifted these days. We need a good laugh and we need to be moved. In the Ruthless Compassion podcast, I speak with a wonderfully diverse group of people. They've overcome daunting obstacles and they're making unique, exciting contributions to our communities and to our world. The Ruthless Compassion podcast is at 145 episodes and counting. Why not have a listen to it today? I like what you say about how, your experience with grief informs your response to the film. And I was thinking about how a lot of times in the movies, when people are grieving, they're broadcasting it, 3 rooms across, right? Like everybody knows they're having grief, right? There's the montage, there's the whole thing, right? Like we all know this person is grieving. Whereas we have these 2 characters who are really suffering in Augie and Midge. And they're both doing it very internally, like they're almost imploded as opposed to exploded. And that's a very unusual choice in movie making, to have the 2 main characters be so internal and unexpressive and repressed and imploded. And, even in their interactions, they're so clipped. It's like 1 word, 2 words, everything is so inward. It's a very different way of the audience viewing the expression of grief. It's not
Absolutely.
your typical Hollywood portrayal of people who are suffering.
Yeah. And it's interesting because there's sort of a different take on that when we get to that, like I said, that really experimental third act. And when the actor leaves the artificial construct of the play and he travels backstage to the black and white section, wondering, am I doing it right? Am I doing it right? I don't understand this character. And then he goes outside to smoke a cigarette on a balcony, and he has this incredible scene with Margot Robbie. She hasn't been in the picture up until this point, and it's mirroring sort of the way that Midge and Augie are in 2 windows opposite each other talking. Well, now here's the character who plays Augie is opposite this Margot Robbie character, and they're both on balconies of different Broadway theaters that are in the middle of a production. She's in some sort of Elizabethan drama, and he's in the Asteroid City play. And I didn't catch this the first time, but when he sees her across the way, he says, "You're the wife who played my actress." And of course, what he means to say is, "You're the actress who played my wife," but he says, "You're the wife who played my actress." And she says, "Oh, sure, I played the wife in that one scene, but it got cut from the play." And she says, "Do you remember what we said? Do you remember that scene?" He says, "No, I've forgotten it." And so she delivers just off the cuff the whole scene to him of this imaginary scene that they would have played and it was a dream sequence of the grieving widower talking in a dream to his dead wife. And she delivers the whole monologue, and she says, "And I say this, and then you say that, and I say this." And it's mesmerizing. But the gist of what she is saying is essentially, "I'm not coming back, and you're going to have to move on." She's basically giving him permission to move on. And it is deeply emotional, especially, I think, for anybody anybody who has lost anybody, that
Yeah.
scene is an absolute knockout. And I think it's also, there's something really really beautiful embedded in it of this actress who got cut from the play. She's no longer part of that story, but she's moved over here and she's in this other play now. And I think, I'm not a super spiritual person, but I think that there's a little bit of a current there of their story together may have ended, but she's off living this other story now. It's not the end of her story, it's just the end of her story here with this Augie slash the actor who plays Augie. So it's and that I think is really the emotional, apex of the film.
And it's funny because it's another layer, right? It's not in the production and it's not in Asteroid City, the play. It's this sort of aside moment where she's recounting the scene as they were to have played it, or as they did play it, but then it got cut. And I think it's such an interesting way, again, to sort of take us out of the action, but put us into the action in this. I'm not sure, I don't know enough about filmmaking and the art of cinema to understand like the point of it. But yes, it was very moving because I think what we felt was, the character who was the actor, I can't remember his name.
Oh, the actor, Jason Schwartzman playing Jones Hall.
Jones Hall. There we go.
Actor.
That's right.
They're
so
such
Jones,
great names, yeah.
I know. So he plays Jones, and Jones is having this little crisis because he doesn't understand what he's doing, and then he goes out to take some fresh air, and then his actress who plays his wife, or the wife who plays the actress, which I thought was a very interesting little Freudian slip. And also the Freudian slip because we're confused about all these different levels of life, maybe not only of the film. And then she gives this beautiful, moving thing, which maybe helps him connect to his character and go back and finish with more of that emotional connection, right? And so it.
Well, and I was going to say, we sort of started with you saying that the framing device felt very distancing to you, which totally valid. But then you also sort of agree that when we arrive at this moment, even if you don't entirely understand, you're getting the emotion, I think. And I think that's the most important thing, that it's a pretty disorienting film, but it's still conveying really deep existential messages, I think.
I agree with you. I think it's one of those pieces of art that you do need to revisit a few times. I'm just reading a book that I read a few months ago because I was listening to a repeat of the CBC, those book shows. CBC is Canadian Broadcasting. It's like our NPR, right? So, so I was listening to another, like a rebroadcast of the original broadcast that got me reading the book in the first place. And I was like, oh yeah, I want to reread it. So I'm rereading it. And it's such a pleasure. And I don't do it enough, rereading a book and just kind of going deeper into the whole thing. And it's really nice. I have to say, it's really nice to do that again. So why not review a film?
Absolutely. And I think that we all sort of, I think we all get pretty exhausted and there's never enough time for anything. But yes, if you have the time to revisit work and have your relationship change to it and deepen, I think it's a pretty incredible thing. And maybe you can only reserve it for the artist who, like I said at the beginning, that I have a pretty special relationship with Wes Anderson. I should say a one-sided relationship. He is not a part of it. But yeah, there are certain filmmakers who I think you're just rewarded. If you're lucky enough to find an artist who really speaks to you and that you feel gets you, then yeah, I think that you're really rewarded by returning to their work and seeing, certainly my relationship to movies that I had when I was in my 20s was different from my 30s, and now I'm in my 40s, and I find myself now connecting with the older people in the movie now, in a way that I would have connected to the 20-year-olds. And also now that I have experienced pretty profound grief in my own life, my relationship to this movie, I think, is so much different than it would have been before I experienced that. So yeah, movies are alive in a way that I don't think we really talk about. That because we're always changing, that means our experience of the films can also change, which is really exciting to me.
Yeah, that's a wonderful point, and I totally agree with you. And I've also been a big fan of Wes Anderson, and I've seen, other than Bottle Rocket, which I didn't get to see, but I've seen everything he's done since then. Even that obscure, I think it was called Isle of Dogs.
Oh, sure. Yeah, the
I
animated
love
one.
that. I love that so much. So yeah, there's some very interesting things that he's done, and I've loved his work. I found this one was the hardest to approach, and I certainly have heard other people say that it's
Hmm.
a harder one to access, but maybe it's because of the themes that he's, I don't want to say discussing, but portraying are hard themes, and he's doing it in a very particular way. I wanted to touch on a couple of the minor characters because I thought that they were very true. We're talking about, cinema and mental health, and the father-in-law character, the late
Sure.
wife's dad, played by the remarkable Tom Hanks, and such a great portrayal of this interesting character. His antipathy toward his son-in-law, Augie, is so clear. And
Hmm.
again, though, it's not over the top. He doesn't like him, he doesn't approve of him. It's mutually understood, but he's not screaming and yelling. He's just, I don't like you, but
Yeah.
you're the father of my grandchildren, so I have to tolerate you, right?
Sure. And
And
I think that one of the smart things that Wes Anderson does is he casts very, very famous people in his movies because I think he really loves these actors. And from all accounts of their productions, it's just sort of a party and everybody has dinner and there's no egos. Everybody checks their ego at the door because they just enjoy working with them. But the benefit of having so many famous faces is, there's so many characters in this movie that you only get a few minutes with each of them. But because we have a pre-existing relationship with Tom Hanks, we can kind of just like launch right into his character. But yeah, I agree. He manages to establish what their relationship is, this sort of we'll tolerate each other, but we don't like each other in just a handful of scenes in just a few quick minutes. It's almost tossed off that they're of different religions. Augie is Jewish and he is, I think, Episcopalian, and that's a source of tension for them. And it really is just and then we barely see Tom Hanks in the black and white version. There's just this split second we're introduced to him, and he looks entirely different from the character he's playing in the Asteroid City play. And he's just got this debonair young Orson Welles sort of a hat jauntily tilted and a cape around his shoulders or a coat jacket around his shoulders. And it's kind of the sexiest Tom Hanks has ever looked, to be honest. So but yeah, he's terrific in it. And that's, it's a much smaller subplot, but it's his daughter's ashes and they're trying to figure out what to do with it. And it's just this, it's played for comic relief, really, because the triplet, the little girls, want to bury the ashes in the ground in Asteroid City, this little podunk town. And he wants something more dignified. But it's a way for them to sort of talk about where they're going to bury her as a way to talk about what they're going
And
through.
also it's because this is where they found out about her death. Like, this is the
That's
place
right.
they found out that she had died, and I'm thinking that that place grounded them because this is where they learned about it, and so this is where they wanted to also leave her. That's my
That
sense of it.
that makes total sense. I hadn't really thought about that, but yeah, this is where they found out.
It's
So
like this is where she died almost, because
exactly.
in their mind, in their hearts, this is where they lost their mother.
Right.
So this is where they leave her, right? And it's like that place will always have that resonance for them because that's where they found out. And,
Right. This is the sacred place. Yeah.
yeah, it's like,
When
where
it could
were
have
you?
been three towns over if he just told them over lunch
Yeah.
instead. So
Yeah.
yeah.
It's like, where were you when, right? So this
Hmm.
is where they were when they found out. Another one quick character I wanted to talk about is the character of June, the school teacher,
Oh,
because
sure. Maya Hawke,
yeah,
Ethan Hawke and Uma Thurman's kid, who's this
yeah,
perfect synthesis of her two parents.
really. So she plays this interesting school teacher who's trying to teach these children science, but the kids keep wanting to take her off course, and she keeps primly trying to get them back on course, and she's like trying to corral cats, right? Trying
Yeah.
to herd cats. And then, she gets taken off course by this love affair that starts with this musician, Montana. And I just thought that her character just struck me as so true to life, because it's this person who thinks they have to play by these rules. And she's very, very, very caught up in the rules. And then she ends up breaking the rules herself by falling in love and just going to heck with it. Right. I just thought
Hmm.
that's so, so true. Right. She's trying so hard, and then she can't sustain because it's just not sustainable.
Sure. Well, and I think, she is tasked with teaching these, it's a school group that was traveling through, and then when the alien struck and the quarantine happened, she got stuck there. And I think I have not heard Wes Anderson talk at all about if there are any kind of COVID analogies here, but to me it was just so striking of this woman who is in charge of these children, and that the safety of these children, who is being forced to go off script, and these kids have questions and she does not have answers, and she keeps trying to steer them back to the lesson, but the lesson was about the solar system, and now everything they know about the solar system might not be true anymore. And I think the character does a wonderful job of trying to not discourage these kids' creativity. She doesn't lecture them for going off course. She just tries to steer them back. But eventually, yeah, she realizes, you know what? Everything that we knew yesterday is no longer. And that applies to everybody who just their entire bedrock of understanding of how things were just gone, because everybody saw an alien, except for then the government tries to say there
Right.
was no alien. Yes.
I wanted to say one last thing about the alien, because that alien, could symbolize so many things. And I don't think it's coincidental that the alien was this black figure, right? I think it's like it's the other, right? And in America, the other has become such a powerful, divisive element, right? Whether it's a black person or an LGBTQ person or a Muslim person or an immigrant, right? Like, we vilify the other and we think that they're evil. But in this movie, the alien comes, picks up the asteroid that had fallen, comes back a little later, drops it back again, and that's the extent of its interference.
Hmm.
It's not trying to cause trouble, it's not trying to kill anybody, it's not trying to
Yeah.
kidnap anybody and experiment on them. So it's clearly other, right? And it looks different, and it's from somewhere else, but
Hmm.
it's not a harmful entity. And I think that's such a powerful, powerful message, because we are so paranoid of the other. We have this, I think, and I want to use the word paranoia, right? We have this paranoia of
Sure.
people who we think, especially like the privileged white cisgender people, we have this paranoia of the other, whether they're people who have color or people who are different sexual orientations or sexual preferences, immigrants, different religions, whatever it is, they're going to cause us harm. They're going to take something away from us. They're going to impose something on us. And in this movie, the other, and it can't be any more other than an alien,
Sure.
it's completely benign, completely and utterly benign. And everyone's making this big fuss and they're whatever, but it's a totally benign character, right? It's timid, it's kind of hesitant, it's like sort of tiptoeing, takes the little
Sure.
asteroid. It's a completely benign character. And I don't think that's an accident, right?
Yeah, and I mean, and it's in a comical presentation too.
Yeah.
Like you said, it's sort of exaggerated, tiptoeing. He has these large
Big
eyes.
eyes. Yeah.
Well, and I think that Wes Anderson tips his hand when we go backstage and we see the character who's playing the alien is Jeff Goldblum, and he's telling somebody, "Well, the alien's a metaphor for something, or the alien's a metaphor," and the woman says, "Well, a metaphor for what?" Well, we're still trying to figure that out. And I think that really the alien exists in order to see how the characters react to it. And you're right, it is a totally benign presence. And so the children react with, interest. And as does the astrologer played by Tilda. I think she's an astrologer played by
Astronomer.
astronomer. Oh, sorry.
It's okay. Slight
Yes,
difference.
big difference. By Tilda Swinton, that they react with excitement and intellectual curiosity, and then the governmental or the military figures react with, well, we got to lock everything down and we've got to beef up our military presence. And so yeah, it's obviously saying a lot about how anybody confronted with the other, if they completely freak out or if they react as if, well, let's meet this thing halfway and let's try to understand it. But yeah, it's, I mean, in a film teeming with so many ideas, I think that too, there's a lot going on there. And I think also it's part of what Wes Anderson is interested in as a filmmaker in terms of references to previous work of like the great 50s sort of creature features and, you know, Close Encounters of the Third Kind. I think he feels a real affinity for Steven Spielberg films, and the music cues sound a little bit like the Close Encounters music too. So yeah.
I personally really liked the fact that the alien was this completely harmless creature, because I think these days that message to me was like so incredibly important and done in such a subtle, again, subtle but lovely way. It's just like, yeah, we don't have to just assume that because somebody is different, or, you know, something is different, that it's bad, it's going to hurt us, it's going to do
Hmm.
something that we don't like. You know, we can maybe all find a way to coexist peacefully. Right.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Well, gosh, you know, we've been talking for a long time. There's lots more we could say, but I will give you a break. But it's been such a pleasure, you know, breaking down this film, and I've gained a lot of insights from our discussion. I really appreciate that.
Oh, thanks for having me on. It was a real pleasure to discuss this film. I think it's terrific. I hope people watch it and then probably watch it a few more times.
Yeah, you know, whatever spoilers we've given, I don't think it's going to really ruin the film, because
No.
it does take a few viewings anyway, so it can just maybe add to some appreciation and understanding of the experience. That was such a great conversation. I really appreciate you coming on the show, Kimberly. Before we go, I just wanted to ask you where people can find you if they're interested in reading your reviews, or learning more about you.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on. It was a really lively conversation. And like you said, I reviewed this film for the Austin Chronicle. We're a progressive newspaper in Austin, Texas, capital city of Texas. And you can find my work at austinchronicle.com.
That's fantastic. Well, thanks again.
Thank you.
This is Dr. Marcia Sirota. Thanks for listening to the Real Mental Podcast. Please leave a review and your comments wherever you listen to podcasts. And don't forget to sign up for my free newsletter at marciasirotamd.com. While you're at it, why not check out my Ruthless Compassion podcast with over 140 episodes and counting? And if you have any ideas for guests for either Real Mental or Ruthless Compassion podcasts, please email us at info@marciasirotamd.com. Happy listening!